And we are live.
All right.
Here we are. I love that
All
background
right.
music, Robert. Did you hear the background music while we were waiting to go on? Wow, that was way cool.
It's pretty intense. Well, hey, good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to introduce you to our podcast series here, the Abandoned Mine Reclamation Chronicles. And the Abandoned Mine Reclamation Chronicles is a kind of a one of a kind podcast that we have conversations with passionate, community minded partners and volunteers, and we highlight outstanding reclamation and community projects and cleanups. We like to showcase some stream improvement and reclamation successes, and then we share, emergent ideas and technologies to reclaim and remediate our legacy abandoned mine lands throughout, well, Pennsylvania here, but all across Appalachia is where we're talking about this work being done, and even in the western part of the country here that has similar problems. I'm your host, Bobby Hughes. I'm the executive director for the Eastern Pennsylvania Coalition for Abandoned Mine Reclamation, and I'm joined by my co-host today, Andy McAllister from the Western Pennsylvania Coalition for Abandoned Mine Reclamation, EPCAMR and WIPCAMR for short. And today, our guest here is going to be Eric Dixon, who's a senior researcher with the Ohio River Valley Institute, and we'll get to talk to him shortly here. But Andy, if you want to give some kudos to some of our
Thanks,
supporters, please do.
thanks, Bobby. We want to thank the Foundation for Pennsylvania Watersheds for underwriting the first 12 episodes of the Abandoned Mine Reclamation Chronicles podcast. The first 13 episodes now have been archived on our YouTube channels, and we're hoping that live streaming personal interviews and discussing timely topics related to abandoned mine reclamation, or AMR as we call it, will engage our audiences on a new level. So feel free to put your questions and comments into the comment box of wherever you're joining us from. Most people will be on YouTube, some on Facebook, wherever. Bobby?
All right, great. Well, I'd like to introduce our guest here this afternoon. Eric, as I had mentioned, is a senior researcher at the Ohio River Valley Institute, where he works on economic and environmental policy throughout Appalachia and beyond. And he studied the program that we're very familiar with, the Abandoned Mine Land Program, for more than a decade. His most recent, we call it AML, AML related publications, is a recent 2026 publication and report that investigated the first 3 years of the AML cleanup program in Kentucky since the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law. There's other recent research that's focused on labor issues in the EV sector, the community benefits on large scale solar projects, and disaster recovery in Appalachian, Kentucky. Previously, Eric has worked as an organizer and policy advocate at the Appalachian Citizens Law Center, where he worked on black lung issues and testified before Congress on mine reclamation policy. And right next to me, I think I can't remember which year that was, but he and I were down there at the same time before the House Energy and Resources Committee, and sort of gave them an earful of what we thought should be happening in Appalachia and what was and what wasn't. So, welcome, Eric, to the podcast.
It's good to be here.
Welcome, Eric. It's so good to see you. It's been a while since we all got together to talk about the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act, and it's very good to see you again, albeit online and virtually. But hopefully soon we'll be able to all meet together. Hopefully at the AMR conference in October, and we're very excited to learn about your organization. Let me get it here. Ohio River Valley Institute. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. And your
Yes.
projects and things like that. But first, we want to start off our conversation by getting to know our guests. So we're going to be, as they say in Western Pennsylvania, Nebby. We're going to be Nebby. Uh, if you don't mind sharing, where did you grow up? Where are you from? Who's your family? Do you have personal connection to mining? That type of thing. So if you could share a little bit about yourself, we'd appreciate it.
Well, first, Bobby and Andy, thank you for having me. It's good to be here. Um, I I'm with the Ohio River Valley Institute, but I grew up in East Tennessee, on the Clinch River, which is actually the boundary between Knox County, where Knoxville is located, and I ended up going to school at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. But it's the boundary between Knox County and Anderson County, and Anderson County is has a very interesting energy history. it it has a long coal mining history going back to the 1800s, actually. And there are some nationally significant labor insurrections that happened. The Coal Creek War, if you're familiar with the Coal Creek War, in Anderson County. But that mining wrapped up to a large degree, maybe totally, before I was born, decades before I was born. And in the 40s, during World War II, as part of the Manhattan Project, the federal government selected Anderson County and a community in Anderson County called Oak Ridge to build a national lab as part of that project. And so there's Oak Ridge National Lab is still there. Y-12 is still there. So there's this energy, and TVA also. The Clinch River was flooded by TVA, and that's the lake that I grew up on. So there's lots of energy history in the county I grew up in, and so I grew up there, and was kind of exposed to mining and nuclear issues. And then I went to school at the University of Tennessee. And then right after school, I moved to East Kentucky, which is where I worked at the Appalachian Citizens Law Center. And I worked there for about half a decade on, working with miners and their family members that miners that have black lung disease, and on the issues that we're talking about today, AML stuff. And I met, when I was living in Eastern Kentucky, I met my now wife, Lindsay, who is from Louisville. And it was funny because if you come to Kentucky from Eastern Kentucky, like if you enter the state in that region, then Louisville may as well be New York City. It's the big metropolis. And people have opinions about Louisville and East Kentucky. And so I kind of had a low opinion of where I've ended up now in Louisville. I love the city now, but we lived in North Carolina for a little bit after that, but then we eventually moved to here in Louisville where we are now.
Yeah, it's good. I remember coming down to an event years ago, and I just Louisville kind of sits in the middle of the highway down there. I can't remember what state route that I was on, but I remember coming in for an AmeriCorps.
Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, it was 65, yeah, and coming in, there was nothing else around it but the city within the highway system. I felt like, as soon as I entered into Louisville, I was like, wow, this is a little bit of a different world than I'm kind of used to back home. But I was going down for an AmeriCorps training, so I thought it was pretty interesting. But
it's interesting you mentioned. You mentioned East Tennessee. Excuse me. You mentioned East Tennessee. I used to work for the state of Tennessee about 30 years ago, and I did a lot of work in East Tennessee. I also worked on Oak Ridge oversight, doing samples for oversight for Oak Ridge. So that's an interesting place. That whole area is very interesting. Yeah, Bobby.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, well, like just in terms of your educational background and your interest in the research side of historic coal mining practices throughout Appalachia, where was your first exposure, and like what did you first start out doing? Was it with ALC, or was it with another organization that got you interested? Or if you go back a little bit further, what is your kind of connection to your interest that you've been involved with for a number of years?
I grew up spending time in creeks and hiking in the Smokies and on the Cumberland Plateau in Tennessee. And my dad in particular got us outside a lot. And so I just felt at home in the woods, fell in love with nature, fell in love with spending time in the water. And when I was in school, when I was in college, I really got passionate about solving public problems. That was really where my interest lied, was like public policy. And so when I graduated, I didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do, but I had these passions I cared a lot about the place, about the Tennessee Valley, about Appalachia more broadly. And I felt really passionate about the importance of this region ecologically. And at that same time that I was graduating from school, the coal industry was tanking. So I graduated from college in 2013, and in 2012 was really when the latest of the big busts happened, right? Fracking had started to take off in 2008, and there were a lot of closures and layoffs throughout the region in the coal sector, in starting in 2012, and that continued, and that affected the whole economy. And so this this economic crisis was kind of unfolding, and there was this big question about economically, what do we do next as a region, particularly in rural central Appalachia. And I had this previous passion that I talked about related to, the land and the water, and so it was kind of the combination of those two things. It was the confluence of those two things coming together, and I came to mine reclamation as kind of this is an opportunity for us to help transition our economy, diversify our economy, and clean up the land and the water in the region that I care so much about. So I come to the issue not just from an environmental perspective, but also what are the jobs that this work supports? How do we make sure that they're good jobs? How do we make sure that we support those jobs and that those jobs are going to Appalachians? And how can that more broadly support or be part of the transition in the region?
Yeah, down in, I was just going to ask down in India, just going to ask Eric down in Kentucky, in terms of the mining impacts, were you seeing as many orange streams that we were seeing up here, or was it more from the post-closure of the active industry and the loss of those jobs? Like, did you see a lot of environmental impacts there?
Eric, did you see that? You did.
The most common AML problem in eastern Kentucky right now, as far as I can tell, are landslides. Like, you see a lot more of, because the topography in eastern Kentucky isn't the ridge and valley that is in a lot of Pennsylvania. In eastern Kentucky, the mountains aren't as high in terms of sheer elevation, but it's a lot of up and down. As soon as one mountain drops, you have a tiny little valley, where the creek runs through, and then it shoots right back up. And so there's really not a lot of flat land. There's not a lot of wide valleys, and there is some water pollution. Absolutely. I mean, it's not that doesn't exist, but I don't think there are as many miles of orange streams in eastern Kentucky, for example, even on a per acre basis or something like that, as there are in Pennsylvania. And I think there's more like up the ridge, you had mining, and then there's a rainfall event that shifts that landscape, and you have a mudslide basically comes down the ridge and pushes someone's house off its foundation, and the AML agency comes in and deals with that.
Eric, you mentioned narrow valleys. Did you start to see the beginning of that valley fill issue when you were in there at that time? The mountaintop removal and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, there are a ton of valley fills in eastern Kentucky, and those were happening. The strip mining in the region goes back to at least the 60s, maybe further back. And then the magnitude of that surface mining increased over the decades. By the 90s, I think you were seeing people characterize it as mountaintop removal in eastern Kentucky or in central Appalachia. And yeah, you were definitely starting to see those valley fills and those huge sites like that.
Okay. Interesting. Most of our listeners, Eric, will be familiar with the Federal Abandoned Mine Land Program, given who our audience is and the type of work we're all doing. But if we could just spend a few minutes going through a bit of a refresher for the AML program nationwide. So, if you can give us a brief history of the AML program, how it's funded, what does it pay for, how does it operate, that type of thing, we'd appreciate that.
Well, I welcome you all to add to this as I go along or at the end, because I know the Pennsylvania AML campaign has been part of the history that I'll kind of tick through, here in a second. So you guys have firsthand knowledge on at least part of the amendments that happened. But so prior to the 70s, there wasn't any federal law on the books that regulated coal mining in this country. There was some state legislation, and Pennsylvania was actually a leader in that. There was some state level mine reclamation that happened in Pennsylvania. You all, I'm sure, know more about that than I do, but that existed in some places. But there was no federal level regulation, and that was important because for a big industry like that, it's important to have across state borders, kind of a level playing field in terms of a regulatory scheme, right? But what this means is that from the time that the first coal mining happened in the 1700s in this country, to 1977, when the Surface Mining Control and Reclamation Act eventually passed, you had tons and tons and tons and tons of coal pulled out of the ground via underground mining or surface mined in the latter decades of that era. That didn't have to be reclaimed. Those coal operators had no federal responsibility to clean up after themselves, and so you had literally centuries of degradation to land and water and threats to human health piling up that just was not being reclaimed. And so there was a vigorous debate through the 70s. There were various pieces of legislation that were proposed and almost got across the finish line, kind of to my knowledge. And then eventually in 77, during the Carter administration, the SMACRA passed. And SMACRA did two big things. It said, hey, if you're a coal operator in this country moving forward, you have a responsibility to clean up after yourself, at least theoretically. That's what the law says. And the second thing is, it said, well, we have this huge pollution problem, these abandoned mine lands that have accumulated that I was just talking about, and we have to do something about that. And so the second big thing that the act does is create a federal level program to reclaim all of that damage from the coal industry. And I think abandoned mine lands are a bit of a misnomer. I mean, we all use that term because it's the common term, but it's not just land, it's water that's polluted. It's any damage or even facilities or machinery or equipment left from the coal industry prior to the passage of the act. And that includes, air pollution to an extent. You have mine fires. You have some mines that are leaking gases like methane. So it's actually land impacts, air impacts, and water impacts. And so the program was created with the act and funded by a per ton fee on the coal industry. The fees is a little bit different if you're doing surface mining or you're doing underground mining. But that was the genesis of the AML program. And actually, I think it's worth, I wanted to just read a kind of preamble to the AML part of SMACRA to kind of keep people into the spirit of it. So let me just pull that up. So this is from the bill. It is the purpose of this chapter to promote the reclamation of mined areas left without adequate reclamation prior to August 3rd, 1977, and which continue in their unreclaimed condition to substantially degrade the quality of the environment, prevent or damage the beneficial use of land or water resources, or endanger the health or safety of the public. So to me, the AML program is a really important program that very few people know about, and is a very, I don't want to say it's not really a radical program, but it's not easy politically to not only create a program that reclaims past pollution, but that does so in a way that's funded, at least in part, by taxes or fees on the industry. And this program does that, and has reclaimed a lot of land and water over the past, over 4 decades now, almost 50 years. And so I think it's a program that very few people know about, but in the environmental world, it's actually really interesting. And it has been, so that happened in the late 70s, in 77. It has been reauthorized multiple times now, 3 or more times now. And we can talk about some of those reauthorizations if you all are interested, but I just wanted to flag, if people are interested in that, like, there have been changes to the program over time. The fee levels have been decreased over time. The funding structure has changed over time. 2 key things there broadly are that the fees have decreased and they've never been updated for inflation, which is just important to know in terms of the funding source. More Treasury dollars have, kind of related to that, have been put into AML reclamation. And in terms of the funding structure, broadly, at the beginning of the program, the states that were doing the most mining were getting the most AML funding. And over time, that structure has changed to give more of the money to states, not that are necessarily mining the most currently, but that have the most historic coal mining. And the reason that the formula is based on that is because if you have more historic coal mining, you probably have more historic AML damage, right? So the goal with that formula change is to try to get the funding more to states that have more AML problems, as opposed to states that might have more current coal mining, but maybe don't have the most historic damage. So broadly, those are 2 kind of trends that have happened over the years. Actually, and there's one other thing that I do just want to flag, is that the AML program has been very bipartisan historically. The AML program has been reauthorized under both Democratic and Republican presidents. It's been reauthorized under both of the Bushes, the Biden administration, and the Clinton administration. And so I think it's just important to note that historically it kind of has a bipartisan history, because people can kind of agree that this is an issue in their community and they want to get it cleaned up,
Oh, and by the way, the
I
Office of Surface Mining was formed also when SMACRA was formed. I don't know if you mentioned that. I had to say for a minute. In 1977, the OSM-RE was formed at that time. So that's the birth of that agency. Anyway, Robert, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, one of our, really great colleagues who passed away a few years back, Louise Dunlap, who was there during that Carter administration, I think, and had a very big hand in probably steering that legislation to get it to look as it does, at that time, with minus some of the recent amendments. But she was very influential, I think, in doing a lot of that early work. And man, she was there for us. You've seen her, Eric, Andy, and I both have followed her around the halls of Congress and getting us to the people we need to get to, and everybody knew her down there. And I was always in awe of just her, her tactfulness, and Anne and I talked about how to people like us who are very passionate about wanting to put things on paper and get it out there and to talk about it just to get the sound bite right. And she taught us and taught me how to do that. And I'll forever be grateful for that. And I know that the spirit of all the work that we still do today lies, within the work that she started. And so I think that's just important to note that we take that to heart, and these communities that we're working for and working in to get this work done. So it's pretty important. But going back to like the bipartisan infrastructure law, or AKA the Infrastructure and Investment and Jobs Act, it's been pushing a significant amount of money and funded into different sectors. And, it's relevant to those of us doing reclamation work on abandoned mines. And the bill is sort of bolstering and infusing a lot of money into programs nationwide, not just Appalachia, but throughout the country. And I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about that and why that's an area of research that you're looking for and looking into as a particular interest of the Ohio River Valley Institute. And what have you found so far? And I know me and you have talked about, you probably talked to Andy too, about, coming into Pennsylvania and taking a closer look at this and just its implementation and how the money gets out and on the ground. So what could you talk a little bit more about that in your most recent work that you've been working on?
Yeah, thanks, Bobby. To give your listeners a little bit of context on the AML part of the bipartisan infrastructure law, I mentioned that the AML program had been reauthorized a number of times. The last time before the infrastructure law was in 2006, and it was reauthorized for 15 years through 2021. So the program was expiring in September 2021, concurrently to this debate that was happening in Congress around a big infrastructure bill. So on the one hand, I think many of us who are interested in AML issues were frustrated that reauthorization came down to the last moment. We would have liked to seen reauthorization happen before 2021. And in fact, if you go back to the 90s, reauthorization was happening before the last minute, which is just kind of an interesting thing. But despite that frustration that, we didn't necessarily want it to come down to the wire, I do think the reauthorization effort benefited from happening kind of at the same time, kind of by happenstance, as this larger conversation about infrastructure in the country. And during a presidential administration that had prioritized infrastructure. And I've actually done some writing about the history of the other kind of fact of the congressional history and the kind of the organizing and advocacy history and kind of the 10 years prior to the infrastructure law related to AML. And it includes, your all's organizations are definitely part of that. So if your listeners are interested in that, Orvie has some writings about it, but I won't dive too much into that history here. I'll just, in terms of the actual policy that happened and our interest in it, the infrastructure law includes 10.8 or 10.9 billion dollars worth of investment in mine reclamation over the 15 years after the passage of that bill. And to just give you a sense of scale, between $8 and $9 billion of reclamation happened in the AML program in the 40 years prior to that. So between the passage of SMACRA and the passage of the infrastructure law, was about $8 or $9 billion of reclamation. And the infrastructure law in just 15 years will do, $10.9 billion to maybe even up to $12 billion worth of reclamation if you add in the AML fees that will be collected and then distributed to the states over that time period too. So it truly was a historic investment in mine reclamation that was achieved in the infrastructure law. And there were, like previous reauthorizations, there were more changes that happened to the program. The biggest being that $10.9 billion is not funded by a per ton fee on coal mining. It's funded by the general treasury. And AML fees do continue. They were reauthorized, but at a lower rate even than previously. And so given that historic investment, our kind of research interest is basically, how are things going? Given that states are getting such a increase in funds at a time when, because coal mining had been declining, AML funds had been declining too. So, in the late 2010s and early 2020s, all the states were getting less and less AML money every year. And it was in that context that this huge infusion happened. And so we did this report, and I'm happy to talk more about it if you all would like, that we released earlier this year that looked at what does AML reclamation look like in Kentucky in particular, because that's where I'm based. So I figured we would start here in the first 3 years after the passage of the infrastructure law. That was kind of our entry point into, our interest.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? I'm having a little trouble
Yes.
with my connection.
Oh, we can hear
At
you.
least you can
Yeah,
hear
we can
me.
hear you.
Okay. Eric, in 2026, you guys published a report about the first 3 years of AML cleanup in Kentucky since the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law. Can you summarize it?
So we published this report in April. It's on our website if people are interested in learning more about it. Our methodology here was, I kind of already spoke to our interest in it, but our methodology, this was, if you're a data nerd or a policy nerd interested in AML stuff, this was a really fun report because we created a new database of the AML construction contracts in Kentucky in the 3 years prior to the passage of the infrastructure law and the 3 years after the passage of the infrastructure law, because we wanted to see what the AML construction market looked like beforehand and afterwards, so we could compare, right? And for those who aren't as familiar with the program in Kentucky, the way that the vast majority of AML reclamation in the state happens is the state AML agency, using the priority matrix that's in that's in SMACRA, the priority ranking system, prioritizes certain AML sites, and then in-house designs those projects. They have engineers that actually design the reclamation plans, and then they bid out via a public procurement process the actual construction of those projects. And so you have the reclamation design that's happening and the administration that's happening within the state agency, but you have when I say the AML construction market, what I mean is that market that is private sector, construction firms that are bidding on AML reclamation projects, winning those projects, and then executing the projects. And so we wanted to see, for example, are the same firms that were doing the work before the infrastructure law still winning the work? Or do we have are there new entrants into the market? Are they in-state firms? Are they large firms? Are they out-of-state firms? So that was one area of questions. And we also wanted to see what the job impacts were at the state agency, how many jobs are being supported, and in the private construction sector doing these AML projects, what are the jobs impacts? And what we found was that I should start off by saying, the state got a lot more money, as I mentioned earlier, The infrastructure law increased funding dramatically. So the state was getting tens of millions of dollars more in AML funding. And what we found was that in the first 3 years afterwards, a lot more reclamation contracts were being awarded, which is what you would expect. But it's good to have research to kind of actually look at this and see what's happening. A lot more reclamation contracts were being awarded. A lot more AML problems were being abated, and that this was supporting hundreds of jobs in the state just doing the reclamation, which is not to speak of the broader impacts on the local economy from cleaning up AML sites. We didn't look at that in this report. This is just the actual reclamation process, And so contracts were getting bigger. The total volume of contracts that was happening was getting larger. Eastern Kentucky and Western Kentucky, which are actually separate coal basins, were both getting more work. And what we found was that the vast majority of the contractors that were getting AML contracts were in-state firms. The vast majority of the contractors that were getting the contracts were actually located, like they're headquartered in counties with AML problems. Because, you kind of wonder, are these contractors that are coming in from the cities and doing the AML projects? In Kentucky, they're not, which is that's a success. These are things that, like, if they weren't happening, you would be concerned and you would want to know about it. But it's really good to confirm that, like, from an economic standpoint, this is going to contractors that are actually in the coal fields. And what we found was that about 500 job years were being supported by the around $80 million in AML funding that goes to Kentucky each year. And most of those jobs are in the construction sector, and they are in the building trades. And for those who aren't as familiar with the building trades, one thing that I think is really important to stress is that the building trades, there are different ways to get into a construction trade. And the construction trades that are typically on AML projects are construction laborers, operating engineers, you're operating heavy machinery on the site, truck drivers. There are different ways to get into those trades, but a common way is an apprenticeship program. And apprenticeship programs are, in particular, union apprenticeship programs are, in my opinion, kind of a best kept secret. These are programs that you earn while you learn. You make money while you're going through the training program. So as soon as you sign up, you're starting to work on the job, and you're all for part of your time, and you're getting training or instruction for part of your time. So you're getting paid, you're making a wage while you're going through the training program, and you're working on these AML projects. You're learning skills that you can do on AML projects, but also other heavy construction projects. So it's a pathway to a career. And one of the things that we looked at in this report that was really a really important finding is that if you're working on a construction project, an AML project in a rural AML county, most of the trades are making a good wage. So, for example, we looked at a couple case studies. We looked at an AML project in Eastern Kentucky. We looked at a project in Western Kentucky, and the main operating engineer trade classification. So if you're operating heavy machinery on one of these sites, you have to be making a wage according to federal prevailing wage law that was at a certain rate. And we compared those rates of compensation to the local compensation rates in those counties for all workers in all industries. And those operating engineers were making above average. So if you were operating heavy machinery on an AML site, you're making more than the average wage across all industries in that county. So not only is it a job that's accessible, you don't have to go to college to get into a construction trade and work on these AML projects, but it's also relatively good paying. And I just think we talk about abating the hazards of AML problems, and that's really important. We talk less about these economic impacts, which are also really important, and that we were really excited to investigate with the Kentucky report.
This is very interesting, Bobby.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I mean, I think I've read through the publication's findings, and I found it very interesting as well. And as we're looking to talk about what's happening in Pennsylvania and what's been happening, and we're receiving a definite increase in interest in funding for these projects, and the State Bureau of Abandoned Mine Reclamation putting out subcontracts and subrecipients, and their RFQs to different consultant engineers. I keep getting added to the list of qualified engineering firms or consultant firms to do more work. It seems like there's ample room for opportunity, competition, and growth to do more projects across the state, in particular for reclamation work on the bigger construction type projects, where AMD stuff is going to be a little bit different, a little more complicated. And when you're looking at active treatment scenarios, and the fact you may need a development plan on the front end of some of those projects that could take a year at least to get the water quality and the flow and chemistry before you can start thinking about treatment options and scenarios. So on the front end of some of those AMD and water quality problems, there's a reason why they're a little bit slower to develop because of that. But from the construction end of reclamation work, that those things can move along a little bit quicker. So, I'm wondering if, we'd like to know if your findings are going to be kind of extrapolated to PA, or are you going to try and do a separate report on that? And, if you're interested in looking into that, what's your process, or is there any way we might be able to help facilitate some of that? And I think we've been having some initial discussions. So what are your plans going forward into possibly looking into Pennsylvania?
Well, as both of you gentlemen know, the AML program in Pennsylvania is very different than Kentucky. The AML problems are different. The funding is significantly larger, and the administration of that funding is different. So I'm not assuming that I don't want to go in really assuming anything in terms of whether the results in Pennsylvania will be the same as in Kentucky, but I want to know. I'm very curious about whether they will be the same. Are we seeing the same kind of trends in other states? And the next state that we're going to look at is Pennsylvania. So we are at the beginning of a research process to do a similar report that I just described in Pennsylvania. And your all's insights have been very helpful along those lines. We look forward to, we talked to BAMR, we've had a good conversation with them. We look forward to talking to other stakeholders, and similarly to how I described in Kentucky, we're going to create kind of a new database on the projects in Pennsylvania, and see what the data shows and see what the trends are, have conversations with you all about on the ground about what those trends look like, and compare them to Kentucky and that kind of thing. So yeah, I'm very interested. I don't have those results yet because it's just the beginning of the process, but because Pennsylvania is Kentucky gets around $80 million in AML funding each year, and Pennsylvania gets over $200 million. So it is nationally relevant what's happening in Pennsylvania, and for that reason, I'm really interested to see what's happening for the sake of Pennsylvania and for the sake of the AML program nationally.
Yeah, I think we're looking forward to seeing how that report and research develops. And and I don't want to be premature in asking the question, but you may have seen some of it in Kentucky. But if you're looking around at some of the other Appalachian states, I'm wondering, and something you may want to ask, or maybe have already thought about the question, is, if you think it's been fair and equitable to have these funds being administered from the federal level and the state level government agencies as a reimbursement only grant program, and the subrecipient agreements, when a majority of the groups that are on the nonprofit level in these communities that are working to try and get these funds on the ground, they already have a limited organizational capability and capacity to kind of professionally get accountants and that type of experience involved with handling the money on these very large grants. And they have to contend with the procurement procedures, the 2 CFR 200, getting a little into the weeds here, but the bidding, the reimbursement only style grant administration. And typically, and we found this out personally, like we don't qualify for loans. We don't qualify for like a line of credit. We try to meet payroll for staff. We want to build capacity to manage these projects. We want to have money up front to be able to pay contractors and pay staff to do the grant administration and the management of these projects. And, these are usually like you have to get a loan, and it's usually an interest-bearing loan unless they give you a low-interest loan, and you've got to pay that back and potentially work that into your project costs. So I don't know if that's something you're going to look at, but I would hope that you do, because I know we're always trying to find ways to work with the state agencies and the federal agencies on how do you make it easier to get this money on the ground, and that needs to happen, because even us on the receiving end to get this money into the communities, that's a very big challenge for us that we talk about year after year. And I know there's lots of administrative things and bureaucratic nature of the way the money has to flow, but there's got to be something's got to give a little bit. And I'm wondering if you either have found that out already or we'll be looking into that.
Well, I want to give a disclaimer at the beginning that I'm kind of mid-process in terms of research, so I'm not sure. I hope to have other conversations with watershed organizations and other stakeholders, and I expect that I'll learn things that I don't know yet about this problem, and so the end findings may not look exactly like what I'm about to say, but I'm happy to share kind of my thinking on this right now. Which is that I've definitely heard this as a concern among watershed organizations and conservation districts in terms of accessing the subaward money, and the AML subaward money in Pennsylvania, just to be specific for your listeners. So a few thoughts on this. I think big picture, this stems from a question about if a state agency has a lot of money, a lot more money than it was getting previously, and it has goals that it wants to achieve, reclaiming abandoned mine lands, what are the best ways? What's the best way to do that? And by best, I think that means it's quality. It's also time efficiency. How do we clean up these sites really well, and how do we do it quickly? And so I think there's this conversation to me is nested within a larger question about does that happen by a state agency ramping up its hiring and doing all of the reclamation in-house? It seemed, or other approaches, and it seems to me like the state agency in Pennsylvania has come to the conclusion that, hey, we're going to do a lot more work in-house, but we're also going to enlist the assistance of the broader network of organizations in Pennsylvania that have local expertise, in particular about the problems that are in their communities, the AML problems that are in their communities, and actually work with them to administer, in a way, the reclamation of some of these projects so that we can get them done at least more quickly. And what I have heard is that, which I think there's a definite logic to that I get. Absolutely. In particular because of what I would consider the information aspect of it, where the AML agency might not have, they have good databases. They have their state database, there's a federal database, both of which have problems, but nonetheless, they have some information on the AML sites in the Commonwealth, but that data is incomplete, and local people know more about the problems related to an AML problem if it's in their on their property, or in their neck of the woods. And so I think there's from that perspective a value added to watershed organizations being involved. So there's probably more you could say about that, but I continue to hear this concern about, in particular, uh, like um, like meeting the uniform guidance requirements
Right.
for when you get a subaward, and so I think that's, to me, it's pretty obvious that it's an issue. Um, I'm not exactly sure what the solution is yet, and I'm learning more about the details of that issue. And I'm always, if you all have more you'd like to share, I'm all ears. I had a really good conversation with Deb Nardone at the Foundation for Pennsylvania Watersheds. My understanding is that, um, and I could have some of this wrong, so forgive me, Deb, or if you all know more, chime in. But my understanding is that they have this working capital. They have diagnosed kind of a similar diagnosis that I just gave, that it is an issue for these nonprofit organizations or small organizations to meet these requirements. And so, how do we solve that issue? And one solution that they have put forward is to provide legal support for how to meet uniform guidance requirements to organizations, and to provide a working capital fund of $1 million that can provide $50,000 loans to organizations that they can then use as kind of a cash flow situation for their subawards, which is fantastic. And I think that's at least partially solves part of the problem. But my understanding is that it's only a partial solution, in the sense that the working capital, or this working capital fund, is at capacity, which is to say the demand for that money is exceeding the supply that the foundation can provide, and that those $50,000 grants, or loans, I should say, are really only practicable for there are different type of subaward grants. You can get a subaward grant for development and monitoring. You can get a subaward grant for construction, and construction grants are usually much larger because the construction is usually a much larger cost, right?
Yep.
So it seems to me like these loans make sense for if you're getting a subaward grant for like developing a project or doing monitoring, because those subaward grants are usually smaller. So the $50,000 can like work from a cash flow perspective. But if you're getting a huge subaward for a construction project, that $50,000 is insufficient. And Deb understands that. The foundation understands that, and so I think that's kind of my understanding mid research process, as I am here right now, about what the problem is and the partial solutions. And it's something I talked to BAMR initially, but I haven't had a conversation with them since I've had conversations with other stakeholders such as yourself. So it's something I also plan to talk with BAMR about again at some point.
Eric, it's something that it's really putting government on the spot. If the government, both federal and state, want more to occur, you cannot rely wholly on philanthropy. You cannot. They have to put in a little bit as well, the problem. And that's what they need to understand and be part of the solution to these issues, and not just wait for somebody else to come along and try to patch things up. Anyway, what questions remain unanswered for you at this point? Let's switch gears. What's in the future for you as far as research? What things are interesting?
The big thing that sticks out to me, I mean, I'm curious about, as I mentioned, uh, what's going on in Pennsylvania since the passage of the infrastructure law. Like that in the immediate term is what's most interesting. So the questions I just talked about. Also, for example, one thing I haven't talked about yet is, what does the union density look like in the AML construction market? What we found in Kentucky was that there weren't any union AML jobs prior to the passage of the infrastructure law. And then the infrastructure law includes the requirement to pay Davis Bacon prevailing wage rates on AML projects, and that probably has a big impact on leveling the playing field for union contractors. And what we found was that in Kentucky, the first AML union jobs have occurred since the passage of the infrastructure law. So I'm really interested in that question in Pennsylvania too. But beyond that, I think the other big question that I have is what big picture kind of dent is the AML or is the infrastructure law having on the total AML problem in this country? So in 2021, in advance of the infrastructure law passing, we did a report at Orvie that did our best attempt at quantifying the true cost to reclaim all of the AMLs across the country. As both of you know, there's a federal AML database, EAMLS, that is incomplete as a measure of the total cost to reclaim all AMLs in the country for a number of reasons. It's incomplete in the sense that the EAMLS only includes construction cost estimates. It doesn't include administration costs or design costs. EAMLS includes a lot of AML problems that were added to it over since 1977, or at least since the early 80s, maybe when EAMLS was first created, and those cost estimates haven't been updated for inflation. So if someone said, "Hey, it was going to cost $50,000 to reclaim this site," in Letcher County in 1985, and no one has gone back into the inventory and said, "Oh, actually, $1,000 now," or whatever. And the other big issue with the inventory is that it's incomplete. It doesn't include all of the sites that are actually in the world, and we're always AML agencies are always discovering and adding new AML sites to it. Maybe we'll get to a point decades from now that we're not discovering new ones, but every year we're still finding new ones, and so.
And on that line, also, Eric, if I can mention also, you're talking about new things happening out there. As a little aside for our listeners, the National Coal Council recently made this comment in a report: suspend collection of the coal abandoned mine land fee, develop a process to assess if or when collection of subsequent fees will be necessary. After nearly 50 years, the coal industry has made AML payments well in excess of the amount required to clean up the historical sites. And that is hugely incorrect because, as you're saying, more sites come up, more crop falls come up, things like that, and costs go up constantly. It's a moving target. That's what we're trying to deal with. There is no one finite thing. You do the best you can. Next year, it's going to be different. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Not only are there underground mine portals that that the state doesn't know about yet. Like part of it's like we find new sites. Part of it's that over time, sites continue to deteriorate and erode, which is to say that just over time, because of weather events, because of erosion, because of extreme rainfall events, the cost to reclaim a site increases. And I'm not just talking about inflation. I'm talking about like the actual site itself becomes more difficult to reclaim over time. So for all those reasons, the federal inventory is incomplete. And in 2021, we did our best at correcting for all of the things that I just described and for actually coming up with a true cost estimate. And by the way, the AML agency officials, they know that EAMLS is insufficient as a marker for the true cost of AML cleanup. They know that. But to my knowledge, no agency has actually done a kind of estimate that we did in 2021 that tried to look at the actual true cost. I have heard some BAMR folks, the Bureau of Abandoned Mine Reclamation, for your listeners, that's the agency in Pennsylvania. I have heard them talk about how they think that the true cost to clean up in Pennsylvania is much higher than the official EAMOS estimate. So maybe they have some internal estimates that they've done or that they'll share publicly in the future. But to my knowledge, nothing has been shared publicly. And so we did this estimate in 2021, and it was at that point in time. Oh man, I wish I could remember, but like the official EAMOS number was like in the range of, I think, 10 to 12 billion dollars is how much the AML cost was. And if you corrected for all the things that I just described, updated for inflation, projected out how many AMLs might be added in future years based on, we used historical numbers as a baseline for that projection. If you added in an estimate of administration and design cost, what I found was that it would cost 2 or 3 times as much as that, 10 to 12 billion dollars to actually reclaim all the AMLs in the country. So I say all this about the 2021 report because a big question that I have is like, how has the inventory changed in the years since the 2021 report? And one reason it might have changed a lot is because state agencies got $25 million to update their inventories. There was a earmark in the infrastructure law of, I think it was $25 million for inventory updates. So they actually got some money to put resources into, okay, let's go into the field or, do various things to try to increase the accuracy of the EAMOS estimates. So I think we would expect that there's more data in there. So I want to look at the inventory for that reason, and I want to compare it to what's happening with AML spending since the infrastructure law has passed. How much is the true cost of that inventory gone up, or maybe gone down relative to the increase in reclamation that we're doing? That's kind of, and that's not currently on the research agenda, but like if we take on another big AML research project, like that's where my interest lies.
It sounds very, very interesting, and we'll look forward to seeing that. Bobby, we're getting low on time. You had one more question, if we can do that one.
Yeah, I just want to say, how can our listeners maybe get more involved with your work for this project? And if you're looking for additional community watershed leaders or other folks to be interviewed, we have a number of them that participated in a survey that we did with Stream Restoration Inc. and the Pennsylvania Organization for Watersheds and Rivers and the Pennsylvania Environmental Council back in 24 that maybe they could be reached out to, and their partners. They'll be at our conference and in October in Grantville, and maybe they could help provide you with some additional insight if need be. So how would you like them to maybe get a hold of you, and what's the best way to reach out if you're looking for that?
I would love to talk to anyone who's interested in talking with me about AML issues in Pennsylvania. So a couple things. First, I would say go to OhioRiverValleyInstitute.org, and on the staff page, find my email. Send me an email if you're interested in talking with me. If you know EPCAMer or WebCamera, feel free to reach out to them to connect us. I hope to be in Grantville at the conference in October. So I would be interested in talking with folks there if you're interested, or like I said, reach out to me. We can have a conversation aside from that conference. I would also invite either of you all, Andy or Bobby, to, yes, I would love to talk to some stakeholders that you all are connected with. That would be great.
You talk to everybody and anybody. Okay. All right. We like to close each episode with a piece of advice to offer nonprofit watershed organizations with respect to organizational capacity and sustainability. You have to share with the community.
I'll share part of my experience, and maybe it can be useful to some organizations that are listening to this. When I graduated from college, I, I had grown up. I had spent a lot of time in the outdoors, but I actually grew up in, what was kind of at the edge of a suburban or rural area. And then I went to school in a city in Knoxville, and I hadn't lived in a rural area before. And I moved to Eastern Kentucky, which is very much a rural area. It's 2 or 2.5 hours to any city, Knoxville or Lexington or the closest. I lived in Letcher County and Knott County at that time. And I worked at the Appalachian Citizens Law Center then. And there's a couple things that really impacted me personally in my trajectory that I just wanted to share. One is that it was so beneficial to me to live in a rural area. And I want to encourage, if you're listening to this and you never have, maybe you're a young person in college and you're interested in these issues, like go live in a rural area. The big part of it for me, it's a different pace, it's a different place, but the big thing for me is that I just have this fundamental belief that there's something about being connected to nature that's part of being a human being. And I think some people are kind of like, well, I'm not an outdoors person, and to a degree, I can kind of understand. Like, I think there is something to, like, some people like to spend more time hiking or whatever, but I might push back a little bit. I would push back on a little bit on that, in the sense that, like, spending time in the countryside and in water and in the outdoors, there's just something about it that it's rejuvenating. And for me, it's about connecting to something that's bigger than yourself. You feel like you're part of something bigger when you're in nature. You're part of a bigger web. And so that was just incredible for me personally, like, just in terms of, like, my life experience. And so I would encourage people to do that. And I would encourage watershed organizations, maybe in Pennsylvania, to. It's definitely important to hire locals and to try to keep young people in Appalachia. But also, I think there's something to the experience that I just shared that was really beneficial. So and so I would say give someone a shot who's from out of state, but who might really benefit from living in your rural county. And then the other thing that I'll just share quickly is that when I was at ACLC in this area, I was a young person. I had no experience with AML, and they trusted me to run my own project and do my own research. And I think that the fact that it's not like I didn't have any mentorship, but, like, I wasn't micromanaged, and there was a sense of, like, we trust you. You're going to mess up. You're going to make some mistakes, but, like, we trust you to fundamentally do some good work. And so I would just encourage organizations to give young people a chance in that way, and, like, trust them, give them some responsibility, because that can really, really, really help people grow. And that helped me. So those are a couple of things from my own experience
That is very, very interesting. Definitely words of wisdom. Robert?
Yeah, it's good advice there, Eric. Appreciate that. We want to kind of thank you again for joining us today, and you're really thankful to have you as a friend and partner and colleague in the abandoned mine reclamation community here across Appalachia, not just in Pennsylvania, but in Ohio as well, in Kentucky, where we have other partners, and up and down Central Appalachia. So, for others that are out there, please tune in for the first Friday of every month here at 12 noon for new episodes of the Abandoned Mine Reclamation Chronicles, and we'll have some interesting guests lined up. We're going to be heading into a season 2 here, if we already haven't, and we're going to be pursuing some additional grant funding to hopefully continue to keep the podcast going. And man, there's just so many great people out there doing inspirational things, and that's what the podcast is really about. And I think we want to continue on with the momentum that we've had over the first year, and expand that into this coming year. And I think there's lots of work and lots of people doing good things out there that we still want to tell their stories, and people with the background that everybody has talked about and have a shared experience with in Appalachia, and just coal, or these rural areas, and even in the communities that were at one point coal was the only thing going, but now it's been changed. It's changed up, and there's more diversification. So, with that, we don't have our guests lined up quite yet for the next month here in September, but we'll put that out there soon, and we're going to be reaching out to some folks to see if we can get them on the schedule. But until then, thank you for participating. And there's a reminder that if you want to advertise on our page and in our podcast in terms of sponsorship, there's an opportunity to do that at the Epcamer store. If you just go to epcamer.org, I'll throw a link in here real quick. And for some folks that are out there, if they want to become a sponsor, those funds will go back into supporting the podcast series as we move forward here into season 2. So with that, thank you, Eric, and we look forward to seeing you in the fall at the conference in Grantville.
And also, Robert, before we say goodbye to Eric, I just want to do a plug for the AMR conference, treatminewater.com, all one word, treatminewater.com. If any of this intrigues you, if you're a college student, if you're a watershed group, look into that. Look into this conference. It's over near Grantville, near Harrisburg. It's going to be the best thing you've ever done. Until then, Eric, thank you so much for your help. You've been a wonderful guest, and we look forward to seeing you in person real soon.
Thank you both.
Thanks, Eric.
Goodbye.
All right. All right, I think Ann has closed out the stream. I don't know if Ann has closed out the stream.
The clock is still running, Robert.
Oh, okay. Let me end the stream. Let's see here.